Megan's polite smile barely hid the tightness in her jaw. "I'm afraid I have to insist, ma'am. There's been a mistake." Danielle raised an eyebrow, her patience thinning. "A mistake?" Her voice was calm but edged with steel. "Or just an assumption?" Passengers nearby exchanged glances, tension crackling through the cabin. The businessman in 3C lowered his newspaper, frowning. A young woman in 5A whispered, "Is this really happening right now?" Before Megan could stammer out another excuse, a deep voice cut through the charged air. "I'd love to hear why you're trying to move my wife." A hush fell over the cabin as heads turned. Standing just a few rows away, tall and composed in an impeccably tailored suit, was Ethan Carter, CEO of Skybridge Airlines, the very airline they were flying on. Megan's face drained of color. But before we dive deeper into this jaw-dropping moment, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Los Angeles International Airport pulsed with energy, a chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the muffled hum of conversations blending with the distant crackle of flight announcements. The sharp scent of fresh coffee mingled with the artificial sterility of polished floors and recycled air, creating the familiar sensory overload of a busy travel hub. Business travelers in crisp suits balanced phone calls and last-minute emails. Parents juggled restless children, and jet-setters in designer coats moved with the effortless confidence of those accustomed to the luxury of first-class lounges. At Gate 47, the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, summoning passengers for Skybridge Airlines Flight 187, a high-profile evening flight bound for New York. This was no ordinary route. This was a corridor of power, frequented by CEOs, celebrities, and high-level executives, the kind of people whose time was too valuable to be wasted in economy. The sleek Boeing 787 waiting at the gate gleamed under the artificial lighting, its metallic skin reflecting the glow of departure screens flickering with updates. The priority boarding line moved swiftly, a parade of wealth and status. First-class passengers stepped forward with practiced ease, some barely acknowledging the flight attendants who greeted them with polished smiles. A hedge fund manager barked instructions into his Bluetooth earpiece as he handed over his ticket. A woman in a tailored Chanel coat nodded curtly as she breezed past, and a silver-held executive glanced impatiently at his watch, sighing as he stepped onto the jet bridge. Every movement was purposeful, every expression carefully composed, a silent declaration of importance. Amid the flow of tailored suits and monogrammed luggage, a woman moved with quiet confidence, her posture poised, her steps unhurried. Danielle Carter didn't need to flaunt her presence. She commanded attention simply by being. Draped in an elegant navy tulle dress that accentuated her tall, graceful frame, she carried herself with the assurance of someone who belonged, someone accustomed to navigating these spaces without seeking permission. The soft glint of her wedding ring caught the light as she reached for her boarding pass, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather of her designer handbag. The gate agent, a young man with a carefully rehearsed smile, barely looked up as she handed over her ticket. "First class, welcome aboard," he said automatically, his tone neutral, his eyes already flicking to the next passenger. Danielle merely nodded, unfazed. She had long stopped expecting acknowledgement in places where people like her were still, too often, viewed as anomalies rather than the norm. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool rush of air from the aircraft's open door sent a shiver down her spine, a stark contrast to the warmth of the bustling terminal behind her. Inside, the cabin exuded quiet luxury. Plush leather seats, ambient lighting set to a soothing golden hue, the subtle fragrance of fresh linens and high-end cologne mingling in the air. Danielle settled into her seat, glancing around at the other passengers as they adjusted their seats and exchanged brief nods of recognition. She had been on flights like this countless times before, yet there was always that moment, that flicker of awareness in certain gazes, the subtle double take, the quiet calculation as someone tried to place her in a category that made sense to them. She ignored it, crossing one leg over the other as she reached for the in-flight menu. It was just another flight, or at least it should have been. Danielle Carter moved through the airport with an effortless grace that turned heads, though not always for reasons she welcomed. At 38, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition, her every step a quiet act of defiance against the unspoken assumptions that shadowed her. Dressed in a navy pull-sheath dress that hugged her figure in all the right places, elegant, refined, but never ostentatious, she was the embodiment of success. The dress, hand-picked from a boutique in Paris, wasn't meant to impress anyone but herself. It was the same with the designer handbag resting comfortably on her forearm, its polished leather gleaming under the harsh airport lights. Danielle never wore her wealth loudly. It was simply a fact of her existence, a testament to the years she had spent carving out a space in rooms where few looked like her. She reached gate 47, where the final boarding call had begun, and slid her first-class ticket across the counter with a composed expression. The gate agent, a young man with a headset perched over one ear, barely glanced up as he scanned the ticket. "First class, welcome aboard," he muttered, already looking past her to the next passenger in line. Danielle hesitated for only a second, long enough to recognize the indifference for what it was. It wasn't outright hostility, nor was it deliberate rudeness. It was the subtle dismissal of someone who didn't fit the expected mold, a tiny fracture in the seamless experience granted to others without question. It had happened before, and it would happen again. With a faint, knowing smile, she retrieved her ticket and strode toward the jet bridge. The clack of her heels against the polished floor was measured, unhurried. She never rushed. Rushing was for those seeking approval, for those afraid they might be questioned at any moment. She had long since abandoned the need to prove her worth to strangers. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, a few passengers flicked their eyes toward her, then away, their expressions carefully neutral. She could feel the fleeting assessments in the air, the quick calculations of where she belonged in the silent hierarchy of this space. It wasn't outright hostility, nothing so crude as that. It was a flicker of surprise, a momentary lapse before faces reset into polite disinterest. Danielle found her seat and settled in. Placing her handbag beside her and retrieving her phone, she scrolled absently through her messages, ignoring the small but familiar tension that came with existing in places where she was never fully expected. It didn't matter. She was here, and that was enough. Megan Porter adjusted the crisp collar of her uniform as she walked briskly through the first-class cabin, mentally running through her pre-flight checklist. At 35, she had been in the airline industry long enough to perfect the balance between warm hospitality and firm authority. She prided herself on efficiency, on maintaining a polished demeanor no matter how chaotic things got. First-class passengers were a particular breed, demanding but predictable. Business executives, high-profile travelers, and the occasional celebrity filled these seats, and Megan had long since learned how to anticipate their needs before they even asked. As she moved toward the front of the cabin, her gaze flicked toward the last few passengers settling into their seats. That was when she saw her, the woman in seat 2A. Megan did a double take, her professional smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she caught herself. Something about the sight of her didn't fit. It wasn't the designer dress or the way she carried herself with quiet confidence. No, it was something deeper, something Megan wouldn't even consciously acknowledge. The ingrained belief that a black woman, no matter how impeccably dressed, was an anomaly in first class. She felt the thought creep into her mind before she could stop it. Did she really belong here? The answer should have been automatic. Of course, she belonged. She had a ticket just like everyone else. And yet the question lingered, unspoken but heavy. Megan straightened, pushing the thought away as quickly as it had come. She wasn't the kind of person who made assumptions. She was just doing her job, making sure everything was in order. That was all. Still, something about the woman made her pause. Megan's instincts, honed from years of managing entitled passengers in difficult situations, told her there had been a mistake. She glanced down at the manifest on her tablet, scrolling quickly through the first-class list. Danielle Carter. The name was right there, perfectly valid. But even with confirmation in front of her, Megan felt an inexplicable hesitation. Her smile returned, but it had shifted, becoming more scrutinizing than welcoming. As Danielle settled into her seat, Megan kept her movements smooth and professional, but her mind continued to churn. Something about this situation felt off. She convinced herself it was nothing personal. She was just being thorough. That was her job, after all, to ensure that everything ran smoothly. And if that meant double-checking a seat assignment, then that's what she'd do. She told herself she was being fair, that it was about protocol, not prejudice. But deep down, a small, unspoken part of her was already convinced something wasn't right, and soon she would act on that feeling. Megan smoothed the front of her uniform as she made her way towards seat 2A, a pleasant but firm smile fixed in place. Her heels clicked softly against the plush carpet, her posture straight, professional. She had handled plenty of boarding mishaps before, passengers mistakenly taking the wrong seat, booking errors, last-minute upgrades that hadn't updated in the system. This was no different. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, stopping beside Danielle's seat. Her tone was polite but edged with something unmistakable, an assumption wrapped in professionalism. "I think you might be in the wrong seat." Danielle looked up, her expression neutral, controlled. There was no flicker of confusion, no frantic reaching for a boarding pass like Megan was used to seeing when passengers realized they'd made a mistake. Instead, Danielle blinked once, then reached calmly into the side pocket of her handbag, withdrawing her ticket with an effortless grace that suggested she had done this 100 times before. She handed it over without a word, her dark eyes watching Megan carefully. Megan took the ticket and glanced at it, scanning for the error she was certain existed, but there wasn't one. First class, seat 2A. Everything was correct. For a brief second, something inside her wavered. The logical thing to do, the professional thing to do, was to hand the ticket back and move on, but the hesitation clawed at her. A part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this was wrong, that somehow this woman was in a seat that didn't belong to her. Her grip on the ticket tightened. "It seems like there might have been a mix-up," she said, keeping her voice even. "Are you sure you meant to book first class?" The words hung in the air, heavier than she intended. She knew instantly that she had overstepped. Danielle's expression didn't change, but something in her gaze sharpened. "I'm sure," she said evenly. Megan forced a laugh, though it felt unnatural even to her own ears. "Of course," she said, but she still didn't hand the ticket back. She hesitated, glancing toward the manifest on her tablet, as if she expected something on the screen to confirm her gut feeling. Danielle didn't move, didn't fidget or show even a hint of discomfort. She simply sat there, composed, watching Megan with the patience of someone who had seen this kind of moment unfold far too many times before. Megan swallowed. She could feel the shift in the air, the growing awareness of passengers seated nearby, the subtle way conversations had quieted. She knew she was at a crossroads. Back down now, and it would look like she had made a baseless assumption. Press forward, and she risked turning this into something much bigger than she intended. But the doubt still gnawed at her, and so, against her better judgment, she doubled down. "I can move you to a comfortable seat in the main cabin," she offered, keeping her voice light, as if she were doing Danielle a favor. "It'll be just as nice." A slow, deliberate silence stretched between them. Then Danielle exhaled softly, as if she had already predicted exactly how this would play out. She reached for her ticket, plucking it from Megan's fingers with a calm, controlled motion. "I'll stay here," she said. And just like that, the weight of the moment shifted. The balance of power, the unspoken assumptions, the entire dynamic of the cabin, all of it crystallized in the air, thick with something unsaid. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. A businessman in 3C lowered his newspaper just slightly, his brows knitting together as he observed. A young woman in 5A leaned toward her boyfriend, whispering something under her breath. Megan felt the heat of their eyes on her, the slow realization that she had crossed an invisible line. But instead of stepping back, she clenched her jaw, convinced that if she just pressed a little harder, she would find justification for the instinct she couldn't shake. "Ma'am," she said again, this time her voice quieter, her smile stretched thin. "I'm afraid I have to insist." A ripple of awareness spread through the cabin as the exchange stretched beyond what should have been a routine seat check. Passengers who had been lost in their own worlds, scrolling through phones, flipping through newspapers, adjusting noise-canceling headphones, began to take notice. The atmosphere shifted, subtle at first, like the faintest change in cabin pressure before turbulence hit. In seat 3C, a businessman with salt and pepper hair and a sharp navy suit frowned, lowering his newspaper just enough to glance over its edge. His keen eyes flicked between Megan and Danielle, reading the body language, the forced smile on the flight attendant's lips, the calm but unyielding expression on the black woman's face. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. He had flown enough first-class routes to recognize a passenger dispute when he saw one, but this was something else. Across the aisle in 5A, a young woman nudged her boyfriend, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp with curiosity. Why is she making such a big deal about this? Her boyfriend, a tall, lanky man in glasses, looked up from his tablet with mild interest. Maybe it's a mistake, he murmured, though his tone lacked conviction. The woman frowned, her brows pulling together as she kept watching. I don't think so. The lady showed her ticket, didn't she? Closer to the front in seat 2F, an older white woman smirked as she watched the scene unfold. Her pearl earrings gleamed under the cabin's warm lighting as she crossed her arms, settling back into her seat with the air of someone who had already decided how this story would end. The look on her face said it all. Some people just don't know their place. Her gaze lingered on Danielle, assessing, dismissing, as though she were watching a predictable play unfold. The murmur spread in quiet waves, passengers casting glances, shifting in their seats, debating whether to say something or keep their heads down. Most did what people always did in uncomfortable situations. They hesitated. Danielle, however, didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch under the weight of the attention pressing in around her. She had lived this moment in different variations too many times before. The judgment, the scrutiny, the expectation that she either justify her presence or quietly accept the insult. She met Megan's gaze, her voice smooth and steady. I don't believe I need to move. My ticket confirms this is my seat. She said it not just for Megan, but for everyone now watching, making it clear she wasn't backing down. Megan's grip on her tablet tightened, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across her face. She could feel the shift happening, the unspoken challenge in the air. This was no longer just about a seating mix-up. It was about the silent assumptions she had acted on, the invisible but undeniable weight of bias now dragging her under the scrutiny of an entire cabin. And yet, instead of stepping back, she pressed forward. Ma'am, she said, her voice quieter but edged with strained patience. I can find you another seat in main cabin. It will be just as comfortable. The businessman in 3C exhaled sharply, shaking his head. The young woman in 5A crossed her arms, her discomfort shifting into something closer to disbelief. The woman in 2F smiled just a little wider. Danielle held Megan's gaze, her lips curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. I said, I'm fine right here. And with that, the tension reached a breaking point, hanging heavy in the air, waiting for the moment when everything would tip. Megan's voice softened, but there was something in her tone that made it worse, not better. A forced gentleness, a patronizing edge disguised as kindness. I'll find you a comfortable seat in economy, she said, tilting her head slightly as if she were offering a favor instead of an insult. It'll be just as nice. Danielle's jaw tightened. She exhaled slowly through her nose, the only visible sign of the frustration building inside her. She had been patient. She had given Megan every opportunity to correct herself, to realize her mistake and step away with her dignity intact. But she wasn't backing off. She was pushing harder, convinced she was right. Danielle felt the weight of every set of eyes on her now. The businessman in 3C, his frown deepening. The young woman in 5A, whispering again to her boyfriend, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more like anger. The older woman in 2F, smug, watching as though she already knew how this would play out. And the rest? The silent ones? The ones pretending to be focused on their phones, or staring absently at their seatbelt buckles? Unwilling to get involved, but soaking in every second. And yet not one of them spoke up. Danielle scanned the faces around her, waiting for even a single person to say, "This isn't right," waiting for someone to clear their throat and challenge what was happening, to say something as simple as, "She showed her ticket," but no one did. She wasn't surprised. The anger curled low in her stomach, familiar, simmering, but she didn't let it rise. She had spent a lifetime learning how to control it, how to push it down so it wouldn't be used against her. She knew exactly how this would look if she raised her voice, if she so much as let a sliver of frustration slip into her tone. She could already hear the headlines in her head: "Disruptive passenger removed from first class." She knew what people would say, how quickly this moment would be twisted into something else. So instead, she smiled. It wasn't warm, it wasn't friendly, it was sharp, deliberate. A smile that had been practiced and perfected over the years. A smile that said, "I see exactly what you're doing, and I won't give you what you want." Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, level. "I don't want another seat. I booked this one." Megan hesitated, just for a second. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, but she wasn't ready to let go. "Ma'am," she tried again, lowering her voice as if that would make a difference. "I really think it would be best if—" "You think," Danielle interrupted smoothly, and now there was something unmistakable in her tone, not anger, but something colder, sharper. "That's the problem." Megan's mouth opened, then closed. She glanced around as if looking for backup, but found none. Danielle tilted her head slightly, just enough to make it clear that she wasn't the one who should be uncomfortable. "You looked at me and decided I didn't belong here. That's what this is about, isn't it?" Megan flushed, but before she could stammer out another excuse, a new voice cut through the tension, deep and steady. "I'd love to hear why you're moving my wife." "I'd love to hear why you're moving my wife." The voice sliced through the tension like a blade, deep, steady, and effortlessly commanding. It wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. It carried the weight of authority, the kind that made people listen without question. A collective inhale swept through the cabin. A businessman in 3C shifted in his seat, suddenly more alert. The young woman in 5A let out a quiet, "Oh my God," under her breath. Even the older woman in 2F, who had been watching with quiet amusement, sat up a little straighter, her smirk slipping just slightly. Megan's entire body tensed, her fingers clenched around the tablet in her hand, and her face drained of color as she turned toward the source of the voice. Ethan Carter stood a few rows away, calm but unreadable. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he radiated the effortless confidence of a man who never had to repeat himself. His sharp brown eyes locked onto Megan, unreadable but direct, giving her nowhere to hide. Danielle exhaled slowly, her entire body loosening in a way that no one else would notice. Not relief, she hadn't needed saving, but there was a silent exchange in the brief glance she shared with Ethan. He had seen everything, and now it wasn't just her holding Megan accountable. Megan's lips parted, but no words came. Ethan took a step forward, slow and deliberate, his presence commanding attention even from those who had been trying to pretend they weren't watching. "I assume," he said, his voice measured, "there's a reason you've decided my wife's seat isn't good enough for her." Megan's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She opened her mouth, closed it again, her brain visibly scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't bury her deeper. I was just..." She inhaled sharply, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "There was a misunderstanding. I was trying to..." Ethan raised an eyebrow, just a fraction, and that tiny movement made Megan stop mid-sentence. The excuse she had been reaching for withered in her throat. Danielle watched, unblinking, as the power shifted in the room. Just moments ago, Megan had been in control of this situation, standing over her, holding the authority to decide whether she stayed or went. But now, with Ethan's quiet, steady presence towering beside her, the imbalance was gone. Megan's voice came out thinner this time. It wasn't about..." "Wasn't about what?" Ethan asked smoothly. He didn't lean in, didn't raise his voice, but somehow the question felt like a trap, one Megan couldn't avoid. She knew she was cornered. Saying the wrong thing could cost her more than just an awkward moment. She needed to backpedal, but there was nowhere to go. It was just a mistake, she said quickly. I thought... She hesitated, then latched on to the only defense she could find. I was just following policy. A quiet laugh. Not loud, not mocking. Just a single, low exhale. Ethan shook his head slightly, as if disappointed but unsurprised. Policy, he repeated. That's interesting, because I'm quite familiar with airline policy, and I don't recall anything about moving first-class passengers without cause. Megan's entire body stiffened. Danielle, still seated, watched the flicker of panic cross Megan's face. She almost felt sorry for her. Oh. The whispers among the passengers grew louder now. People weren't just watching, they were engaged. The businessman in 3C muttered something under his breath. The young woman in 5A clutched her boyfriend's arm, her expression a mixture of shock and fascination. Megan tried again, her voice barely above a whisper now. I didn't mean... Ethan let the silence stretch, letting her feel it. Then, with quiet precision, he delivered the final blow. Let me make this easy for you, he said, adjusting his cufflinks as though the conversation was already a foregone conclusion. I'm Ethan Carter, CEO of Skybridge Airlines, and the woman you just tried to remove from first class is my wife. Megan's face went completely white. The air in the cabin felt charged, as if the entire plane had been holding its breath. Danielle watched as the reality of the situation fully sank in for Megan. The moment she realized she hadn't just embarrassed herself, she had made a career-altering mistake. For the first time since this started, Megan was speechless. And for the first time, she understood exactly how badly she had miscalculated. Megan's breath hitched, her grip tightening on the tablet as her mind scrambled for a way out. The weight of the moment crashed down on her with the force of a tidal wave. She had spent the past several minutes trying to quietly remove a woman from first class, and now she realized she hadn't just targeted any passenger. She had tried to humiliate the CEO's wife. Her mouth opened, then closed. Words failed her. Ethan Carter remained composed, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way he stood, in the measured way he blinked, that made it clear he wasn't a man who tolerated incompetence, or worse, bias masked as procedure. He had been watching from the moment Megan first approached Danielle, but he hadn't spoken right away. He had waited, allowing Megan the opportunity to recognize her mistake. She hadn't. The realization sent a sickening chill down Megan's spine. Passengers were no longer pretending to mind their business. The businessman in 3C leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his attention locked onto the unfolding scene. The young woman in 5A clutched her phone, though whether she was still recording or just holding on for dear life was unclear. The older woman in 2F, who had previously been smirking, now looked distinctly uncomfortable, as though she had suddenly realized the winning side had shifted. Megan forced a breath, her voice coming out weak. Mr. Carter, Ethan raised a hand, a simple, effortless motion, but it shut her down instantly. He wasn't interested in hearing whatever excuse she was about to fumble through. He took a slow step forward, his presence looming larger now, as if he were filling the entire space around her. I watched this whole thing play out, he said, his voice calm, but his tone carrying an unmistakable weight. I watched you question my wife when she showed you her ticket. I watched you hesitate even after you saw her name on the manifest. And then I watched you double down when there was no reason to. Megan's cheeks burned, her pulse hammering in her ears. Danielle, still seated, crossed one leg over the other. She wasn't gloating. She hadn't said a word since Ethan stepped in. She didn't have to. The weight of the truth was enough. I wasn't trying to... Megan started, but Ethan's gaze sharpened and the words shriveled in her throat. You weren't trying to what exactly? His voice was smooth, lethal in its control. Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like you assumed my wife didn't belong in this seat. Megan's mouth was dry. She had to fix this. She had to say something. I was just following policy, she blurted out, latching onto the excuse like a life raft. Sometimes passengers mix up their seats. I was just trying to... Ethan let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Policy? He repeated, his brows lifting slightly. Is that what we're calling this now? Megan swallowed hard, her skin prickling with the heat of humiliation. Tell me, Ethan continued, his voice deceptively casual, when was the last time you walked up to a white passenger in first class and insisted they booked the wrong seat? When was the last time you saw a well-dressed man sitting comfortably in first class and assumed he didn't belong there? The cabin had gone eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the engines beneath them. Megan's entire body went rigid. She didn't have an answer. Ethan didn't break eye contact. I'm waiting. Megan inhaled sharply, but the truth was suffocating. There was no policy she could hide behind, no excuse that could erase the fact that she had made an assumption, a damning one. Passengers started exchanging glances, the energy in the cabin shifting once again. The businessman in 3C shook his head as if he had seen enough. The young woman in 5A muttered, "Wow, just wow." Her boyfriend exhaled through his nose, muttering something about lawsuits under his breath. Megan felt the walls closing in around her. Ethan took another slow step forward, his presence overwhelming. "Now," he said, his voice quiet but razor-sharp, "I'd like to hear your explanation. Because if this is policy, then we have a much bigger problem than just you." Megan knew in that instant that there was no way out. A ripple of realization spread through the cabin like an electric current, crackling with unspoken tension. The silence that had settled over first class only seconds ago shattered as passengers reacted, some in hushed whispers, others in outright disbelief. The young woman in 5A, still clutching her phone, lifted it higher, her eyes wide as she started recording again. Whatever moment she had previously captured had just escalated into something much bigger. Her boyfriend muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as he leaned in closer, unable to look away. The businessman in 3C exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw tightening as he set his newspaper aside completely. He had been on hundreds of flights, and he had seen entitled passengers argue with flight attendants before, but this was different. He wasn't the type to get involved in other people's affairs, but watching the way the flight attendant squirmed under the weight of her own mistake stirred something in him. He shook his head, disgusted, muttering just loud enough for the people around him to hear, "Unbelievable." The woman in 2F, who had been so smugly entertained by the whole thing only moments ago, suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat, adjusting her pearl necklace as her gaze darted between Megan and Ethan. She had assumed she was watching just another entitled passenger getting put in her place, but now she saw the mistake for what it was, and she didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of it. A murmur ran through the rows, a low hum of conversations bubbling just beneath the surface. Some passengers exchanged knowing glances, while others just sat in stunned silence, as though they had been forced to confront something they weren't sure how to process. Megan's breathing grew uneven, her cheeks burning under the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She could feel the energy in the room shifting against her, a slow, inevitable tide turning in real time. Her carefully controlled authority had slipped through her fingers, and now she stood there, exposed. She had spent years perfecting the balance of polite authority, knowing exactly when to press, when to soften, when to insist, but now she had no script for this. "I wasn't trying to..." Her voice cracked, too weak to carry over the hushed conversations around her. She turned her head slightly, looking desperately for support, but there was none. The young woman in 5A, still recording, spoke up, her voice clear and sharp. "No, you were trying to," she said, not bothering to hide her frustration. "You didn't believe her. Even after she showed you her ticket, you still thought you knew better." Megan's eyes widened slightly, as if the words had physically struck her. She turned toward Ethan, her lips parting, but nothing came out. She had already tried to explain. She had already tried to talk her way out, but there was no talking her way out of this. Danielle, still seated, didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't say a word. She simply watched, her expression unreadable, as if she had seen this exact scenario unfold too many times before. The patience in her gaze wasn't surprise. It was recognition. Ethan let the moment stretch. the silence between them growing heavier, suffocating. Then, with quiet finality, he spoke. "You had every chance to correct yourself," he said, his voice low but cutting, "and every time you chose not to." Megan opened her mouth, then shut it again. She looked around one last time, searching for an escape, but there was none. The weight of her mistake had settled over her, inescapable, and for the first time she truly understood what she had done. "B is a funny way of showing itself, doesn't it?" Ethan's voice was calm, deliberate, but it struck like a whip. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. The weight of his words was enough. His eyes stayed locked on Megan, unwavering, watching as she visibly recoiled from the question, her breath catching in her throat. I wasn't..." Megan stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard, the heat of humiliation crawling up her neck. She could feel the eyes on her, feel the collective judgment settling like an unbearable weight on her shoulders. The businessman in 3C let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "This is disgusting," he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. His voice carried a finality that made Megan flinch. She turned toward him instinctively, as if seeking an ally, but his expression was cold, unforgiving. His posture, once relaxed, was now rigid with quiet fury, his hands gripping the armrests as though restraining himself from saying more. Megan turned back to Ethan, desperately searching for words, for an excuse, for a way to make this moment disappear. But there was none. Ethan took a step forward, slow and controlled, his presence overwhelming without needing to be loud. "Tell me," he continued, his voice as smooth as ever, "what exactly were you trying to accomplish here?" Megan's fingers tightened around her tablet. I was just making sure there wasn't a mistake," she said quickly, grasping at the only explanation she had left. "Sometimes seat assignments..." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. "Seat assignments?" he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Right, because that's what this was about." Megan swallowed again, the dryness in her throat making it harder to speak. "Do you often question first-class passengers about their seats?" Ethan pressed, his voice carrying just enough edge to make the question sting. "Or does that only happen when someone like my wife is sitting in one?" Megan's breath came in shallow bursts now. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to insist that wasn't what had happened. But she couldn't. Not when the truth was hanging so thick in the air around them. Passengers were shifting, some nodding in quiet agreement, others whispering among themselves. The young woman in 5A had stopped recording but kept her phone in her lap, watching intently, her eyes burning with quiet rage. The businessman in 3C muttered something under his breath again, shaking his head as if this was exactly the kind of thing he expected, but still hated to witness. The older woman in 2F had gone silent, her earlier smugness replaced by something else. Unease, maybe, even shame. She cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably, suddenly unsure of where to look. Megan's hands trembled slightly as she forced herself to meet Ethan's gaze. She started, but the words died before they could fully form. Ethan let the silence stretch, let it press down on her until it became unbearable. Then, with a final, measured look, he spoke. "You need to think very carefully about what you say next." Danielle exhaled slowly, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest as she shifted her gaze from Ethan to Megan. The weight of the moment pressed down on the cabin, thick with unspoken truths, but she didn't revel in it. She didn't need to. She had spent years navigating spaces like this, dodging assumptions like invisible tripwires, enduring the silent tests of whether she truly belonged. This wasn't new. It was just another version of the same story she had lived too many times before. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or throw a victorious glance toward her husband. Instead, she sat with the quiet, unwavering confidence she had carried since the moment she stepped onto this plane. And then she spoke. "No," she said simply, her voice smooth and precise, slicing through the tense air like a razor. "You meant it." Megan flinched, her breath catching. Danielle didn't raise her voice, but the power in it was undeniable. She turned slightly, her sharp eyes sweeping over the cabin, over the faces of the people who had watched this unfold, the ones who had whispered but stayed silent. She lifted a hand, gesturing subtly toward them. and so did they. A ripple of discomfort passed through the rows. A few passengers looked away, suddenly very interested in their seatbelt buckles, their drinks, their hands. The businessman in 3C held Danielle's gaze, his lips pressing into a thin line, but he didn't look away. The young woman in 5A shifted in her seat, her grip tightening around her phone. The older woman in 2F, the one who had smirked earlier, tensed, her fingers curling against her lap as though bracing herself. Megan's throat bobbed as she swallowed, her hands gripping her tablet so tightly her knuckles turned white. I wasn't trying to... Danielle tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Trying to what? Megan opened her mouth, but no words came. Danielle leaned forward slightly, not enough to be aggressive, but just enough to make it clear she wasn't done. You didn't question anyone else's seat, she said, her voice like silk laced with steel. You didn't hesitate when they sat down, but when you saw me... She let the sentence hang unfinished because it didn't need to be. Megan's breath hitched, her gaze flickering to the passengers watching, waiting. Danielle straightened, her tone unwavering. The worst part? You weren't alone. The second you questioned me, the second you insisted I didn't belong, everyone else made a choice. She let her eyes scan the room again, her meaning heavy, undeniable. Most of them chose silence. A sharp, collective discomfort rippled through the cabin. The businessman in 3C exhaled through his nose, nodding just slightly as if acknowledging the truth of her words. The young woman in 5A shifted, looking suddenly uncomfortable, as though realizing that recording wasn't the same as speaking up. Even the woman in 2F, the one who had enjoyed the show moments ago, crossed her arms over her chest, her smirk long gone. Danielle turned back to Megan. I don't need your apology, she said quietly, and that was when Megan's face truly fell. What I need is for you to understand that this isn't about a seat. Megan's lips parted, her face ashen. Danielle's gaze didn't waver. This is about what you saw when you looked at me. Megan stood frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears as Danielle's words settled over her like a crushing weight. The air in the cabin had thickened, pressing in on her from all sides. The murmurs had died down. The shifting glances, the uncomfortable fidgeting, none of it masked the truth anymore. The silence was deafening. For the first time, Megan felt the full gravity of what she had done. Not just a simple mistake, not a harmless misunderstanding. This had been a judgment call, a decision made in an instant, shaped by something she could no longer deny. She had looked at Danielle and, without thinking, had placed her in a category that didn't belong here. That was the truth. Her fingers trembled against the edges of the tablet. Her uniform, once a shield of authority, now felt suffocating. She had spent years believing she was fair, professional, that she treated all passengers with the same level of care and respect. But standing here now, with every set of eyes drilling into her, she saw it for what it was, a lie she had told herself. Danielle's gaze remained steady, unwavering, not cruel but unrelenting. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't angry, she was simply holding up a mirror, forcing Megan to see herself as she truly was in this moment. Megan's breath came unsteady, her throat tight. Her mind scrambled for something to say, something to fix this, to explain herself in a way that wouldn't make her look worse. But there was nothing, no excuse that would make this go away, no explanation that wouldn't sound hollow and pathetic. She had been wrong. The businessman in 3C let out a long exhale, rubbing his temple. The young woman in 5A looked down at her phone, her earlier eagerness to record now replaced with something more solemn. Even the woman in 2F, who had been so sure of her place in this moment, shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing that her silence had made her complicit. Megan swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She had thought she had power in this situation, but as the silence stretched, as the weight of her actions became unbearable, she realized the truth. Danielle had been the one in control all along. The tension in the cabin lingered, thick and unshakable, as if the plane itself had absorbed the weight of what had just happened. No one spoke, no one moved. The businessman in 3C, who had watched everything unfold with an expression of growing unease, finally exhaled. His fingers drummed against his armrest before he turned slightly, catching Danielle's gaze. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, not one of pity or condescension, but recognition, a silent apology, an acknowledgement of what he had witnessed and failed to stop. Danielle held his gaze for a moment before nodding back, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. The young woman in 5A, who had been clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles had gone white, finally looked down at the screen. Her fingers hovered for a second before she tapped, uploading the video she had recorded. She didn't caption it with outrage, didn't twist it into a dramatic spectacle. Instead, she kept it simple. This is why we still need to talk about race. The words hit the internet like a slow-burning fire, small at first, but destined to spread. Even the woman in 2F, who had been so smugly entertained when this started, now sat stiffly in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She refused to look at Danielle, refused to acknowledge what had just unfolded, but the shame was clear in the way she pressed her lips together, her eyes darting toward the flight attendants huddled at the front of the cabin, unsure of what to do next. Megan was still standing, her fingers gripping the tablet as if it were the only thing holding her upright. The realization of her mistake had settled over her like a crushing weight, but there was no fixing it, no rewinding time. Danielle hadn't raised her voice, hadn't caused a scene, and yet she had won in the most undeniable way, and Megan had to live with that. Back at the airline's headquarters, Ethan wasted no time. The moment they landed, he was on the phone with his senior executive, setting a meeting first thing in the morning. By the time the boardroom filled, the video had already started gaining traction online, and Ethan's decision was swift: mandatory racial bias training for all airline staff, a complete re-evaluation of company policies, and a clear expectation that what had happened on Flight 187 would never happen again. Megan, having been pulled aside by her supervisor before even leaving the airport, knew the conversation she was about to have wasn't optional. She had spent the entire descent replaying the moment over and over, feeling the burn of her own actions in a way she had never felt before. When she was finally called in, she didn't argue, didn't try to defend herself. She knew, and when she was asked to apologize, to truly apologize, she did. Not because she had to, but because for the first time, she understood exactly why she should. And she knew she would never forget it. Danielle settled back into her seat, exhaling softly as she adjusted her posture. She wasn't shaken, she wasn't angry, she was simply tired. The kind of exhaustion that didn't come from long flights or jet lag, but from the weight of moments like this, moments that shouldn't still be happening. Ethan reached for her hand, a subtle but intentional gesture, the warmth of his palm grounding her in the present. His touch wasn't for comfort. Danielle didn't need that. It was acknowledgement, a quiet way of telling her that he had seen everything, that he understood in a way only he could. She gave his fingers a small squeeze before releasing them, turning her gaze toward the window. The cabin, once filled with the hum of conversation and the casual chatter of travelers, was now eerily quiet. No one knew quite what to say, or if they should say anything at all. The businessman in 3C sat stiffly, his hands clasped together as he stared blankly ahead, still processing. The young woman in 5A had stopped recording, but her phone was still gripped tightly in her hands, her knuckles white. Megan had retreated toward the galley, her body language stiff, her expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken another word. Whether it was because she had nothing left to say, or because she realized that words wouldn't fix what had just happened, Danielle didn't know. And she didn't care. The woman in 2F, who had smirked earlier, shifted uncomfortably, crossing and uncrossing her legs. She kept sneaking glances toward Danielle and Ethan, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had been entertained when she thought Danielle was about to be put in her place, but now? Now, she looked uneasy. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy. A room full of people who had just witnessed something bigger than they expected, something that forced them to confront the way they saw the world, and none of them could escape it. Danielle didn't need an apology. She didn't need validation. She had spent her entire life knowing that respect wasn't something she had to earn. It was something she was entitled to, just like anyone else. And today, she had made sure they all knew it too. Now it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed injustice but stayed silent? What would you have done if you were on that plane? Would you have spoken up? Would you have challenged what was happening, or would you have watched, hoping someone else would? It's easy to say you would have done the right thing. It's easy to think you would have. But when the moment comes, when the weight of silence feels safer than speaking, when the fear of standing out outweighs the discomfort of watching something unjust unfold, what would you have done? Would you have been the businessman in 3C, realizing too late that you should have said something? The young woman in 5A, documenting but never intervening? The woman in 2F, entertained until the entertainment turned into something she didn't want to be part of? Or would you have been the voice that broke the silence? This isn't just a story, it's a reality that happens every day. In airports, in restaurants, in offices, in schools. And every time it happens, there is a choice. To speak or to stay silent. What choice will you make the next time? Respect isn't given based on appearance, it's a right. When we assume, we fail. But when we learn, when we listen, when we challenge our own biases, we change the world. What do you think? Have you ever been in a situation like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because these conversations need to keep happening. Because change starts with moments like this. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected. Every conversation, every moment of reflection, every time we choose to challenge injustice instead of ignoring it, we take a step toward that world. The smallest actions ripple outward, shaping how we see each other, how we treat each other, how we build a future that refuses to be defined by the prejudices of the past. You have a voice. You have the power to make a difference, whether it's in a crowded airplane cabin, in a workplace meeting, in a classroom, or even at your own dinner table. You have the choice to confront bias when you see it, to uplift those whose voices have been silenced, to recognize the weight of silence and break it. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't cause a scene, but she refused to shrink herself to make others comfortable. She didn't accept disrespect dressed as authority, and in doing so, she turned the moment into something bigger, something undeniable, something unforgettable. The next time you see someone being dismissed, underestimated, or treated as if they don't belong, what will you do? Will you look away? Or will you make sure they are seen? The choice is yours. Make it count.